Hello everybody, in this video we're going to take a look at something called jQuery Mobile. In fact, we're going to take a look at how you can build mobile websites very easily using jQuery Mobile. So let's get started and let's talk about what jQuery Mobile actually is. So jQuery Mobile is basically a HTML5 based user interface system that works with most of the major mobile device platforms. So you're talking iOS, Android, BlackBerry, and things like that. And it's actually built on a combination of items. It's built on jQuery, which hopefully most of the web developers at this point are familiar with. It also combines jQuery UI, which is built on top of jQuery and offers some really cool UI type elements. It combines CSS3, which is sort of the latest iteration of CSS that is supported by most major web browsers, and of course it combines it uses HTML5 itself. So given what it's built on, what are some of the base requirements that you as a developer would need to know to actually use jQuery Mobile? Well, turns out it's pretty much the same as the second bullet. You'd have to have some basic familiarity with jQuery, of course. You'd need to know where you can get the jQuery files. You'd need to know how to link to them in your pages. You'd also need to know how to use jQuery UI. So if you've not used that before, I definitely recommend that you visit the jQuery UI site. jQuery UI can be really useful if you've got forms, for example, that have, let's say, a field where you want the user to enter a certain date. jQuery UI has a nice UI element called a date picker utility where you can incorporate some code, and when the user taps into that field, it opens up a little calendar that they can then select a date from. So some really cool stuff that's available within jQuery UI is used within jQuery Mobile. There's of course CSS3. You'd have to have some familiarity with that as well. You'd want to know, what some of the new things are with this generation of CSS. For example, I think CSS3 introduced some very easy to implement rounded corner functionality. There are shadows. There's reflections that you can implement, lots of cool stuff, and of course HTML5. At the very minimum, you need to know how to use the new HTML5 doc type tag. So you don't have to be an expert or a master at any of these technologies, but you have to have at least played with them, used them in some way, shape, or form before you begin using them in jQuery Mobile. So now that we've talked about some of the base requirements, I guess the next question is, why should you even use it? Well, we've already talked about one major item, is that it's easy to build, and it allows you to build cross-platform mobile websites. Now, typically when you're building a mobile application, you kind of have to determine who your target audience is. So perhaps you are targeting the Android platform or the iOS platform, or maybe you're targeting all of them. If you're doing the latter, which is you're really targeting every single device, then one of the difficulties that you run into is that you have to create a native application for each of these devices. Now, of course, that's not entirely true these days because we've got technologies like Flash that allow you to write one application and then essentially export it out as different so-called native applications for the different platforms. But even that will require you to learn a new technology, a new programming language. So in the case of jQuery Mobile, you write your jQuery code just by incorporating certain jQuery Mobile related source files, and then you use standard HTML or even your favorite programming language. So there is no need for you to learn a new programming language like Java or Objective-C or even ActionScript, and most importantly, don't have to create these individual apps for each target platform. So that's one major reason why you should use jQuery Mobile. I also mentioned a second ago that you can use your favorite programming language. Well, one of the nice things about jQuery Mobile is that you can combine it with your favorite programming language and build some really powerful applications. Now, bullet 2 relates to something that we're seeing on our network. Is we often do check our analytics data to see who's visiting our network and what sites they're looking at. And we've started to discover that a growing percentage of devices on our network are mobile devices, of course. And it just stands that we should probably build our sites or build versions of our sites that are targeted towards these users. So that just makes good business sense and is probably one of the reasons we even started looking at jQuery Mobile. Now, having said that, is jQuery Mobile sort of the ultimate solution? Unfortunately, it's not. That's because there are certain methods or functions that are available to native code that are not available to jQuery mobile apps. For example, let's say you want to build a website that allows the user to pick a image from their photo roll on their device. Well, that may not actually be possible or may not be easy to implement in jQuery mobile. There may also be certain hardware functions that can only be accessed via native code. Perhaps you want to turn on the user's mic. That's not functionality that you can actually use using jQuery mobile. There's also this idea of network dependency. Because jQuery mobile is essentially a mobile site, the content lives on your server, which means if the user does not have an internet connection or maybe doesn't have a signal and cell network, they can't get to your site. A lot of times when you're building mobile native applications, you may bundle the information within your application itself, which allows the user to be able to access that content without having to be dependent on the network. And last but not least, native apps are still very much the ideal way to deliver mobile content. They're sort of the way people expect to get access to mobile content. People like the ability to go to an app store anywhere they are and download an app and get the the nice graphical user interfaces and things like that. And to get their content delivered through app stores is still very much the trusted way of getting mobile information. Native apps will also come with this nice functionality where they add an icon to your screen automatically with mobile sites. Yeah, you can still do that, but it's not quite as slick. So I would say if you are a mobile developer, you're still very much in business. But if you're not a mobile developer, here's a great way for you to develop and deploy mobile content. So having said that, let's kind of dive right in. One of the ways we're going to look at how you can get started with jQuery mobile is taking a look at some applications that I've written. They're very basic, but we'll take a look at the source code for those applications, and I'll walk you through some of the components that I had to implement to build these sites. Before we look at code, I also want to point out the jQuery mobile website, which is just jQueryMobile.com. So be sure to go there. You'll need to download some files to actually get started if you are taking your first steps with jQuery mobile. Let's also talk real quick about some of the items we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at the different types of jQuery pages, and I'll talk about this in just a second here. We'll take a look at some examples of the transitions that are available within jQuery mobile. We'll take a look at this idea of headers and footers as they apply to jQuery mobile. We'll look at some examples of how you can deploy buttons in jQuery mobile, and then we'll also talk about list views. If you're a mobile developer, you might also know these as table views, and we'll take a look at an example where we do a nested list view or nested table view. So let's get started. I'm going to pull up the applications themselves, and let's get started by first looking at a page that I built that uses the two different kinds of jQuery pages. So when we're talking about pages in jQuery, we're essentially talking about what you could call two different kinds of pages. The first kind of page is what I would call an external page, and these are sort of the traditional pages that you and I are probably building in our sites. Say you've got a website that has 5 different pages. That would be page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, and page 5. These are individual pages. They actually exist. And this would be an example of an external page in jQuery mobile. So it has different content. That content doesn't reside on the same page. Now, jQuery also makes use of what it calls internal pages. And the best sort of comparable example that I could give you is this idea of named anchors. So if you've worked with HTML pages before, you have no doubt run into something called named anchors. And people might not recognize the name. But what named anchors are is if you've seen a page where it has a list of items at the top of the page, and if you clicked on one of those items, it automatically jumped to a particular section at the bottom of the page or in the middle of the page that related to that item, well, that's a named anchor. You're using an anchor tag to navigate within the same page. This concept is what jQuery uses to define what it calls internal pages, right? And it's very important that you understand the difference between the two. It's a very simple distinction, but it allows you to do some pretty interesting stuff. We're also going to, like I said, be looking at transitions. So as this first example, what I want to do is show you the UI elements within this page itself. So here's a simple application we built for an office. It's called the Women's Center. And you'll notice a couple different things. You notice that it's got a header, a footer. Within the header, there is this info button. There's also a menu, which has 4 menu items, and then there's some content on this page itself. So notice that as I scroll down, the header and footer disappear, but then they reappear again. That's because of a certain property that I've applied within jQuery Mobile to these 2 UI elements, and that forces them to always be visible. Also notice that there's this info button. If I click this button, a transition occurs and you see the page flip, and it sort of gives you the credits for this page. Now there's also a button on this secondary page. If I click it, the transition occurs again and it flips back. Now, so if you're an iOS developer, for example, you might call that a page view controller, where there is sort of, or a flip view controller, where there is a flip transition occurring to show you some additional information. I can also click on these different buttons and go to these different pages. You notice that when I clicked on FAQs, a quick transition occurred where the content got loaded up sort of with a fade effect. And then you'll notice that there is now another list view here. And if I were to click on this particular row, for example, you'll notice that it transitions over to what looks like a new page, and then there's some more detailed information about that particular element. So let me go back and do that again. I clicked on the first item in our list view or table view, and it basically transitioned over to what looks like a new page with more information about that particular item. Now, the reality, of course, is that this is not a new page. It's in fact the same page that we saw a second ago. So let me hit back. This page and this subsequent page are one and the same. And the concept we're using here is that idea of internal pages. So let's do a view source on this particular page so you can see how that's actually working. So let me go here and do, I believe this is the page I want, and so let me expand this page a little bit so you can actually see all of the content. I'm also going to go ahead and just zoom in a little bit so you can see the code a little bit better. And here we go. So let's break this page down real quick. So you'll notice that one of the first things is, because we are using HTML5, we have to use the super simplified HTML5 doc type tag. You'll notice that all it has is a bang, doc type, and then HTML. So it's very simple. I would recommend that if you're not familiar with HTML5, take a look at like W3 Schools or something like that to get a better idea of how HTML5 works. Now, you'll notice that right at the top, I have to include some jQuery assets. This is basically just some CSS files and some JavaScript files relating to jQuery and jQuery Mobile that I need to make this page function. So I like to include them right at the top of the page, and that's what I'm doing here. I also sometimes download the files and put them on my own server so I can link to them, but you can also do what I'm doing here, which is just linking straight to the files on the jQuery Mobile site. Now, as we scroll down, you'll also notice that there is this additional tag that I've put a comment on here that says this meta tag is required, else mobile Safari attempts to scale this page. This is sort of a gotcha that I discovered when I first got started using jQuery Mobile. I did not include this tag initially and would discover that on most devices the pages work just fine. But if you were using an iOS device, mobile Safari would attempt to scale the page. And this got to be really, really annoying, and I wasn't sure why it was occurring. So I did some research and discovered some other developers had run into the same issue, and one of the suggestions they had made was to include this particular tag verbatim. So you'll notice that it's just a meta tag. It says content width equals device width. We set a minimum scale value and a maximum scale value, and then we set the name to be viewport. So you're going to unfortunately have to just include this verbatim if you are intending to have these pages be viewable on an iOS device, and that will prevent that scaling from occurring in mobile Safari. Now, within the page itself, you'll notice that I'm going to be defining different sections, and sections are just sort of one of those ideas within HTML5 where you can break down the different pieces of your page. You can very easily also use a div tag if you so desired. So you'll notice that I open a section here. It's called FAQ page, and I end that section here. You'll also note that within that section I give it an attribute of data role. So this is a jQuery Mobile attribute. I set the data role equals to page. And then within that particular section, I start defining other sections. So here I use the HTML5 attribute of header. I could use div if I wanted to, but I use header here. Once again, you'll notice this data role attribute show up over and over and over again within each sort of section or element that we create. So here it says data role equals header, and we say data position, which is another attribute, and we set it to fixed. So the header attribute here is what allows us to essentially get that nice black bar that appears at the top of the page, so that there is a nice header. The data position attribute, on the other hand, is what allows that particular header to be fixed. So if you remember, as I scrolled up and down on the page, that particular header and footer it disappeared for a second, but it came right back. So that's what allows us to have that fixed position. Now you'll also notice that within that header we had an info button. That's right here. You'll notice that I have a link. It's just a standard href tag, but for that link I've assigned a data role equals button attribute. Again, that same data role attribute appears. This time we set it to button. We also set a class in this case that says UI-button-right. The reason we do this is because within jQuery Mobile, typically the buttons will appear on the left hand side, so within this header value. So if we don't set this option of UI button right, our info button would be on the left. I wanted it to be on the right, so I've set this particular attribute. I also set a data transition attribute, and I set it to flip. So this is what allows me to click the info button and see that nice flipping transition occurring, and the second page, which is credits.cfm, gets loaded into it. I also set a data icon equals info attribute. That's what gives me this little I button here. So if you like that, you can of course include the data icon equals info option. And this particular attribute has several different values it can take: info, about. There's actually a fairly long list that has, I think, 10 to 15 items. So take a look at the jQuery mobile site for a better sort of listing of what's available there. Now, I also create a navigation bar, and that's these elements here. So these are all just buttons. But one of the things we do here is we create a nav element, and we set the data role equals navbar. That's what allows the buttons to be side by side. Now within the navbar itself, we use a standard unordered list, and you'll notice that it's just a standard unordered list, and it has list items in it. Now within these list items, of course, we've got link tags, and we've got standard these href tags here, and you'll notice that I'm pointing to different pages, and you'll notice that some of these links also have additional attributes. So here we say data role equals button, because we do want them to be buttons within the navbar, and that's something that we'll set on each of these items. We also set a data transition on this one called fade, because what I want to do is when you click on that particular button, I wanted to do this particular fade effect to load up that data. So you'll notice that pretty standard stuff. We've got standard list items here. You'll notice that with this particular one, I've also set an attribute called external, a rel equals external, and that just says this is an external page and it should be loaded as such. And then we've got some other transitions. As you can see, we've got pop set here. So let's keep going down this particular page. Now you'll notice that I'm actually defining the content on this page, and you'll notice that again I open up a div. I could have opened up a section or whatever I wanted to, but in this case I use a div, and I said data role equals content, and you'll see that this is my whole div tag right here. Now within this, of course, is again an unordered list, and you'll notice that again I set this data role equals list view value, and I also set an attribute called data inset equals true. I'll show you an example of where this actually gets applied in a second here, but the data role equals list view is what allows me to have that table view or list view on the actual page. Now this page you can kind of see has this nice sort of rounded rectangle, and you've got these rows, and then there's a detail view value here. This detail view value is actually, or this detail view icon is being set because we've got a link tied to that particular item. So let's go back to the page. One other thing I guess I should point out is notice how these are set away from the edges of the page. That's being set because of this data inset equals true property. If I remove this, those particular table view or list view items would go from one end of the page to the other. So the data inset equals true gives you that nice little margins on the left and the right. So now as we look through this particular unordered list, you'll notice again standard list items, but you'll also notice that I'm setting links on each of them. That's because I want to get that particular detail view icon here, which is the little arrow. If you've done any kind of mobile development, you'll know that this typically indicates that the user is to tap this row to get detailed information. So if you don't have detailed information, you almost do not want to have this particular here icon there. So as we look through these lists, you'll notice that each of these items within our list view or within our unordered list is linking to a page and says page 1 through page 7, and of course they have the pound symbol in front of them. Now typically when you have an HTML page and you've got this pound symbol and you're linking to it, it implies you're linking to a named anchor. That is you're linking to a section on the page that you want to jump to, and that's the exact same concept we're using with internal pages. So you'll notice that I'm linking, for example, with this particular item that says what is a women's center, I'm linking to an item called page 1. And if I scroll down here, you'll notice that I've defined a section whose ID is page 1. So this is the example of the internal page. Remember when we clicked on this first item, it transitioned over and it looked like we were going to a different page? Well, we were not. We were going to the same page, and this is how we're doing it. So we click here on this particular item, it jumps us down within that same exact page with a nice transition that looks like it's going to a different page to this particular section. So here you'll notice that I've got a section ID of page 1. That's what helps me get to that section. And then again, I've got that same standard header and navigation bar information. And if you're wondering why I'm replicating this, it's because in a standard HTML page, I don't really have a good way to do what you call a virtual include. I would have to use an SHTML page or maybe a programming language to include all of this information on one page and keep calling it over and over again. Since we're just using this as a simplistic example, I actually have to replicate the header and the navigation information as well. But here's the meat and potatoes of this section where you can see we've got some detailed information about that particular item. You'll also notice that I've given a back button, and that's of course this back button here that allows me to go right back to that first piece of content. So you'll notice that this back button also links to a named anchor or an inside page, and in this case this inside page is really just a link to this first section, which is FAQ page. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can use internal pages within a jQuery application. So now let's take a look at another example, a slightly tricky one when you're building native mobile applications. So I've got here what we call an A to Z index. It's just basically a listing of the different departments, and as part of this page you'll notice that it's really just a simple table view or list view, and again the header functionality is fixed, and you'll notice that there's quite a few items here. Now one of the cool things about this page is I can actually filter it. So let's pick an item like activities, and I'm going to filter my content on this page, and you'll see as I start to type, jQuery mobile filters that for me and I get this activities sort of information page. And this is a detail view, so I could technically click this and be taken to sort of the detail page for this particular item. So we go back, and you'll notice again we're back. So again, I can just start typing, and on the fly jQuery mobile will sort of filter that for me. So if you've done any kind of mobile application, native application development, you know that this is not the easiest thing to implement. You know, on a very basic level you might have to use some kind of a mutable array to be able to filter some of these down so that it only displays what the user wants to see. But in jQuery mobile this is actually super easy to implement. So let's take a look at the source for this particular page, and as we're looking at it, you'll notice that again we've got that same super simplified doc type, we have our assets, we've got our meta tag that makes sure that Safari won't scale this, and then as we come down you'll notice that I've opened up a section called first page, and we say the data roles page. Again, some standard stuff from what our first example was, and again we've got a header. We've also got a navigation, which is the letters of the alphabet that were relevant for this application. You'll notice they go from A to W. And then of course the content of the page, which is really what we're interested in. So you'll notice again all the items on this page, so let's clear this, are actually just list items, and you'll see that they appear as such here, and you'll notice that each of them also links to an external page. So we'll just scroll down back and forth. But what's really making that filtering possible is this simple attribute here. So you'll notice that this is an unordered list that I've set the data role equals list view. That's to give me that particular nice list. But the data filter equals true attribute is what allows me to actually create that filtering function. So how easy is that? One particular attribute and you have the ability to filter the content. You'll also notice that I've got a item here with the data role of divider, and that's just to Let me just reload this page real quick, and that's just to allow me to have this currently viewing text here that is an item that won't be filtered. It's just there so that it's sort of a nice indicator as to what the user is actually looking at. So that's it. That's all you need to do to implement a filterable list view or table view, is include this particular attribute on any unordered list with the data role property of list view, and then just include your list items. This would require a significantly larger amount of code if you're building a native application, whether it's iOS or Windows Phone or Android or any of those other devices. So hopefully this gives you an idea of sort of how powerful jQuery Mobile is and how easy it makes implementing some of these much wanted and sort of common features that you see with a lot of mobile applications. So that being said, we're going to take a look at one last example in which we'll see a case where I've used a nested list view or a nested table view, and that's usually a popular topic for most mobile developers, and we'll take a look at it in just a second here. So here's our final example with the nested list view. So here what I've got is I'm going to a quick little application that has multiple list views in it. So you'll notice that again this is a standard. We've seen this before with the other two examples. We've just got a standard set of a standard list view with a bunch of items in it, and you'll notice that it has a detail view icon to its right. So if I click on it, it slides and shows me the different the options on this particular page. Let me go back and click on another option here real quick. Reload this page. Here I'm going to click on the menu item called Computer Labs. If I click on it, you'll notice that it loads another list view. Now this list view also has another table view or list view within it, and you'll notice that these also have sort of these detail view controllers. And if you're wondering why I was refreshing my page so many times, it's simply because this is a mobile page, I have the ability to sort of slide back and forth on it, and since I'm viewing this on my computer, you'll notice that this occurs on your machine as well when you build these pages. And that's sort of, you could say, one of the downsides to building mobile applications, is because if that scaling occurs, then the user sort of starts to see the page float around just a little bit. But it's a minor annoyance, and considering all the benefits it offers, not one I'm too concerned about. So in any case, you'll notice that if I go back, I clicked on Computer Labs, I had a list view, I clicked on the item called Computer Labs, that loaded another list view, and essentially what I can do from here is actually tap on this row and go to a third list view. So this is an example where we've got a list view within a list view within a list view. So here you'll see I've got a transition on it, and I can in fact load up this second list view with a bunch of times in it. So I'm going to go back. So the code for these pages are of course pretty standard. I'm going to keep going back here. There's nothing too crazy about any of the code here. We can do a quick view source on it, and you'll see that it's essentially the same. Again, I've got the same exact assets up top, that same exact meta tag, and one of the things that I'm doing on this particular page is combining jQuery Mobile with a technology called ColdFusion, which is a programming language I like to use. And it makes it really easy to do some powerful stuff. For example, you don't see any of the ColdFusion code because ColdFusion is a server-side language, which means all of the code gets executed and then sort of the results are presented. But one of the things that I'm doing on this page, for example, if I were to go to this call center option, is I'm combining ColdFusion to take a look at the time on the server, and then comparing that to certain values I've got stored in a database, and say if the time on the server is between a certain set of times, this particular office is open. So that should hopefully give you an example of some of the basic things you can do, but you can also, the sky's the limit. You could combine this with some really cool functionality, some really cool logic, and really create some powerful web applications for mobile devices and people that are visiting your site with mobile devices. So hopefully this was I know this was a quick introduction to jQuery Mobile, but I'm hoping that it does enough to whet your appetite in terms of wanting to go out and take a look at this technology, because it's really cool, it's really powerful, and it'll allow you to build content within a fraction of the time that it takes you to build a native applications. Having said that, don't give up on the mobile application stuff, because native applications are definitely the way to go, and you can certainly build some powerful stuff in native applications that I think with functionality that's not quite available in jQuery Mobile. But jQuery Mobile is one of the best tools I've discovered this year. Thanks for watching.